Roth IRAs, 401ks, health savings accounts, traditional IRAs, all of these account types get a lot of hype when it comes to saving and investing for retirement, and rightfully so. But the taxable brokerage account, in my humble opinion, is the unsung hero among them all. In this episode, we're going to break down how this account type thrives in all three phases planning for retirement: accumulation, distribution, and legacy. And then I'm going to touch on a few mistakes that I see as we've helped folks plan for and execute a successful retirement. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining another episode of the Planning for Retirement podcast. My name is Kevin Lau. I am your host, and I'm also the owner and lead financial planner at Imagine Financial Security. We help individuals over 50 with at least $1 million saved maximize their retirement spending, minimize their lifetime tax bill, and worry less about the financial markets. If this describes you, make sure to follow our podcast and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're putting out weekly retirement-related content specifically designed for you, PFR Nation. And if you're interested in learning more about working with our firm one-on-one, you can visit our website at imaginefinancialsecurity.com, or you can start with the Retirement Readiness Questionnaire that is linked in the description below. So I'm not doing this episode to tell you not to max fund your 401ks or your Roth accounts or your HSAs or other qualified plans. But if you're in a position where you are maxing some of those qualified accounts, you've checked some of those boxes off, and you're still saving a little bit more in addition to that. And right now, maybe it's just going directly into your checking account or a high yield savings account, which is very, very common. This episode is designed for you. And this is oftentimes where the pitch for insurance and annuities come into play, which I'm not saying is a bad solution. Okay. I'm not saying it's a bad solution, but we're going to break down taxable brokerage account. We're going to talk about the different phases and the benefits in these different phases. Again, accumulation, distribution, and legacy. And then again, I'm going to talk about some of those downsides, some of the pitfalls that I see individuals running into as they use these accounts to plan for and execute retirement. So why don't we start off with the accumulation phase? I think the biggest benefit, in my opinion, is the wide open contribution limits. There are no max contribution limits like an IRA would have, or an HSA or a 401k plan. You can contribute as much as you'd like or as little as you'd like into these brokerage accounts, okay? And so it's one of those things where if you have maybe windfalls that happen, maybe it's a liquidity event, maybe you sold a home or you sold a business, or maybe it's an inheritance and you're like, hey, where should I put these dollars? I can't really contribute into my 401k or Roth account. Maybe you can put these into a taxable brokerage account, establish a taxable brokerage account, and start to get those dollars invested according to your specific investment objectives. The second part to this during the accumulation phase, and why it's such a big, strong account when you plan for retirement, is the unlimited investment option, okay? When you've got a 401k or a 403b account or a TSP, you've got some sort of qualified plan with your employer, you're going to have a menu of options in terms of the investments you can select. And sometimes that menu is pretty good. Sometimes it's not very good. And so the nice thing is, just like a traditional IRA or Roth IRA, the brokerage account, you can invest in whatever you'd like. Individual stocks, individual bonds, mutual funds, exchange traded funds, alternatives. And you can optimize this for your specific investment strategy and coordinate it with those other accounts that you might have, but also maximizing it for tax efficiency and cost effectiveness, which is really, really important. And that actually transitions to the third point I'm talking about, is tax efficiency and the growth. I think a lot of times these taxable brokerage accounts have like a negative connotation associated with them because they're called taxable brokerage accounts. At least that's what we call them in the industry. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, I don't want a taxable account. And then you get these insurance pitches for life insurance salesmen or annuity salesmen that are trying to, talk you into investing your after-tax dollars into those buckets because they're not taxable. Well, listen, these brokerage accounts, if you set them up properly, can be extremely tax efficient. Why don't we just start with the equity side? So if you own stocks and these stocks are paying dividends, qualified dividends, those dividends most likely are going to be treated at your long-term capital gains rate, which is either going to be 0%, 15%, or 20%. So it's actually a little bit more cost effective from a tax standpoint than owning or receiving taxable interest from, let's say, a high yield savings account or a CD or a bond. And so I think that's one of the kind of the misnomers, is like a lot of these illustrations that I see on these insurance policies that are being pitched. The assumption is the effective rate is what you would pay on your brokerage account, which is not the case. You're going to be paying long-term capital gains, most likely for a good chunk of it if you structure it properly. And again, that's only going to be for the dividend payments that are made on a quarterly basis, which again, if you structure this properly, some of your equities might pay dividends, but some of them might be for growth. And the growth-oriented stocks you're not going to pay any tax on the capital appreciation until you sell that particular investment. And again, that would be treated either as a short-term or long-term capital gain. If you hold the asset longer than 12 months, it'll be treated as long-term. If you hold it less than 12 months, it would be treated as short-term. So short-term capital gains are taxed at basically it's your marginal rate. So if you're in the 24% bracket, you'll pay 24% in short-term capital gains. So if possible, you want to avoid selling something within 12 months. You want to wait longer term. And then you can take advantage of the long-term capital gains rates, which for most of you listening will probably be 15%. But there's also opportunities when you retire, your W-2 income goes to zero. Maybe you're earning a little bit of dividends and interest income, but maybe your pension is delayed. Maybe your Social Security is delayed. You might be in the 0% capital gains bracket for a period of time. So this is a great opportunity to harvest gains during that distribution phase. But I digress. We're going to talk about distribution here next. But you can structure the equity piece to be very tax efficient via dividends and also capital appreciation. And then you could also structure the fixed income side to be tax efficient as well. Meaning if you are in a higher tax bracket, you can own municipal bonds as opposed to taxable bonds. The benefit there is municipal bonds are tax exempt at the federal level. And if you buy your own state's municipal bonds, they're also tax free at the state level, most likely. But so therefore, if you are in one of those higher tax brackets, you could avoid paying tax on that interest income on the fixed income side. If you're not in a high tax bracket, it could make sense to just treat that as taxable interest and invest in taxable bonds like corporate bonds or even treasuries. But again, you got to weigh the pros and cons, and it kind of depends on what those spreads look like for munis versus taxable bonds. But again, my point is you can structure not only the equities, but also the fixed income to be extremely tax efficient during this accumulation phase. So don't let any insurance person kind of talk you into buying some sort of policy just because the growth is tax deferred or tax exempt from a 1099. It's just like, that's half true. Okay. Again, yes, the brokerage account is going to be taxable. Every year you receive a 1099 from that custodian, whether it's Schwab or Fidelity or Vanguard, whoever you have your brokerage account with. But you can own tax efficient investments within those brokerage accounts, which we'll talk about in just a little bit later when I talk about the mistakes that I see people make when it comes to these brokerage accounts. Let's not talk about the distribution phase. Okay, so the distribution phase, now you're at retirement and you're like, okay, what's the game plan? How am I going to take distributions out of my portfolio to replace my income? Well, oftentimes for early retirees, folks that retire, let's say before 60, they're kind of in this pickle where, they're not eligible for Social Security. If they have a pension, usually, maybe that starts at 60 or maybe it's at 65. And, they're thinking, hey, my 401k or my IRA, I'm going to be hit with a 10% penalty if I tap into this account before 59 and a half. What other accounts can I tap into to avoid that 10% penalty? Now, a quick little footnote on this one. I understand there are some ways you can tap into your funds in the qualified side, whether it be a 401k or an IRA prior to age 59 and a half. There are some exceptions to the rule, but in general, you're going to jump through some hoops in order to do so. Whereas the taxable brokerage account, there is no early withdrawal penalty. So if you are one of those individuals that plans to retire before 59 and a half, you don't have to worry about those hoops to jump through. You can start distributing assets from this taxable brokerage account without any worry about that 10% penalty. Okay. The second thing on the distribution side, like I mentioned too, in the accumulation side, is the capital gains treatment inside these accounts. You don't pay any tax on appreciated assets until you sell that particular investment. Okay. And again, like I mentioned, 0% rate, 15% rate, or 20% rate for long-term capital gain. So if you've held those assets longer than 12 months, you will be subject to long-term capital gains, which again, 15%, if you compare that to, let's say your marginal rate is maybe 24 or even 32%, most likely, that's a nice little tax benefit there of tapping into appreciated assets at long-term capital gains rates versus your marginal income rate. So this could create opportunities to really keep your income down, your taxable income down during those periods of time where maybe you want to do some Roth conversions, or maybe you want to look at, hey, you need to buy health insurance because you're not Medicare eligible. And so you're looking at things like ACA subsidies. And so you're looking at the insurance marketplace. You're like, okay, this is income based on how much subsidy I receive. Well, tapping into your brokerage account, because again, you've already paid taxes on your basis. So there's no tax due. The only tax will be due on gains in the portfolio. But then the third piece here is you can leverage tax loss harvesting to your advantage to offset some of those gains. And again, not only during that year, This is something that you should be doing on an ongoing basis. If you have a taxable account, you're contributing to on a regular basis, there's going to be ups and downs on the market. The market just doesn't go straight up in value on a year after year basis. So there could be opportunities like in April of 2025, where you can harvest losses. And what I mean by that is you can say, okay, I have a paper loss. I bought this investment for 100,000. Now it's worth 90. Okay. You still believe in this investment long term, but you have a $10,000 unrealized loss. Well, that doesn't do you any good from a tax standpoint unless you sell that investment and now you have a realized loss of $10,000. And then you might say, well, Kevin, why, I don't want to sell when the market's down. I want to sell when the market's high. So if I sell when the market's down, how am I going to participate in the recovery whenever that does happen? Which, by the way, is happening right before our eyes at this point in time. Okay. So what you would do once you realize that loss is you would replace that security with something that's not identical. Okay. Not substantially identical, but something that's kind of similar. Okay. Maybe it's an exchange traded fund that tracks, the US equities, and you replace it with another US equity fund, but has, some different features to it. So it's not substantially identical. So therefore, what you have now is you have a similar position when it comes to exposure into a certain sector of the market, but now you have that $10,000 realized loss, and you can use those realized losses either in that current year to offset capital gains, or you can deduct up to $3,000 against your ordinary income and or carry forward some of those unused losses in future years to do the same thing. So what you can do is, as you're in the accumulation phase, you can do this tax loss harvesting strategy and build up what I like to call this war chest of realized losses that you can use to offset capital gains when you're in that distribution phase. So oftentimes what we find is if you do this strategy right, you can keep that taxable income super low despite you might having some realized capital gains as you're making those distributions in those early phases before you start tapping into that next bucket. Very, very important. And this also helps with rebalancing too. So as you're rebalancing the portfolio, you might think, hey, I'd love to rebalance it to get back to my target allocation. But if I rebalance, I'm going to be subject to significant capital gains. Well, if you have that war chest of carry forward losses, you can use those unused losses to offset those capital gains, not only on distributions, but also during rebalancing. Okay. And I think, a big one as well from a distribution standpoint is creating this bridge until you hit Social Security or until you hit required minimum distributions. So maybe you plan to delay Social Security until 70. You're like, hey, I need a bucket of money I can tap into for the next 10 years to not only distribute income, but also to potentially pay taxes if you're doing Roth conversions. We've done multiple episodes before on this Roth conversion window. So maybe you're in that Roth conversion window, you're using your taxable account to distribute income, but you're also using that taxable account to pay the taxes on those Roth conversions. Huge opportunity for that distribution phase. And then number 3, the final phase, which is legacy. I think the biggest benefit here that folks will receive is the step up in cost basis. Okay. So you've accumulated a substantial amount in the brokerage account. You have substantial unrealized gains. And if you sold those assets when you're living, you might owe some pretty substantial taxes. Okay. And that we see this all the time with clients. So they're thinking through, hey, what investment should I sell during my lifetime to distribute income versus what investment should I leave to my kids when I pass away? Well, the taxable brokerage account is one of the most efficient vehicles you can use as a legacy play because of that step up in cost basis. So the way this works is, let's say you paid $100 for the investment and now that investment's worth $10,000. You have a substantial gain on that investment. Okay. And so if you sold all of that, you're going to be paying taxes on about $9,900 of that $10,000 sale. However, when you pass away, this particular piece of property, these stocks, these bonds, these ETFs, these mutual funds are then going to receive a cost basis, a step up in cost basis. So your heirs, your children could then turn around and say, okay, I received this $10,000 in securities, but now their new cost basis is not $100 anymore. Now it's $10,000. It's the fair market value, the date of you passing away. So they can turn around and sell those assets and reinvest those assets based on their goals, their preferences, their retirement planning objectives, basically not have to pay any taxes. I'm obviously simplifying this one because, the markets may move a little bit from the date of death versus the date of sale. You kind of get what I'm saying is you're going to have a substantial opportunity to essentially sell, or your children will, to sell those assets and pay very, very little capital gains taxes versus if you sold them during your lifetime, you might pay substantial taxes on that as well. This also holds true with things like real estate. That's why real estate is another great asset to pass on at your death. Just like stocks, bonds, mutual funds that are held outside of a retirement account, those assets, real estate, also receive that step up in cost basis. Another thing I'll really think through or help you think through is, or I'd highly encourage you to think through is, the legacy play with these taxable brokerage accounts. Absolutely. If you're leaving these assets to your children, great tool to leverage and leave those assets to the next generation. What if you're leaving those assets to charity? Okay. Charities don't care about a step up in cost basis. They're going to receive all that income tax free anyways. So if you're charitably inclined and you have a taxable brokerage account, you could think about this as not necessarily a legacy play at death, but a legacy play during lifetime. And you can give some of those securities either directly to charity and you won't have to pay any gains on those or any taxes on those gains. Or you could potentially donate those to a donor advised fund or a charitable remainder trust. And therefore, again, skip the capital gains tax and potentially receive a pretty nice tax deduction during your lifetime. So again, not only helping the charity, which you were ultimately planning to do anyways, but now you actually participate in those tax benefits by gifting those securities during lifetime as opposed to leaving those securities at death. So really thinking through that legacy play in terms of, again, what are the best accounts to leave to your heirs? What are the best accounts to spend down during your lifetime or even gift during your lifetime? So again, taxable brokerage accounts, super efficient when it comes to flexibility on contributions, flexibility on investments. Again, the misnomer around a taxable brokerage account being tax efficient, very, very overplayed in my opinion. I think that's overblown. There are substantial tax benefits to investing in that brokerage account. Again, capital gains taxes, tax loss harvesting, tax gain harvesting, the step up in cost basis. And then finally, all along the way, as you're accumulating those assets in this brokerage account, that is 100% liquid. So if something popped up, let's say an opportunity came about, or maybe you need liquidity for whatever reason prior to you turning 59 and a half, maybe it's early retirement, there's no 10% early withdrawal penalty. So the timing of when you take those assets out or doesn't matter relative to, let's say, a 401k or an IRA. You're going to be a little bit more restrictive when it comes to taking funds out of those particular accounts. So again, I want you to stop thinking about these taxable brokerage accounts as a less tax advantage vehicle. This is exactly what these insurance agents and these annuity agents want to sell you. They want to tell you that, hey, once you've maxed out your 401k plan or IRA, now you want to contribute to their life insurance policy that's juiced up with a bunch of fees. Don't necessarily believe that. Okay. Again, life insurance has a place, annuities have a place, but you can create a very tax efficient strategy within these brokerage accounts. Okay. So just a few mistakes on this one, just a few mistakes that I've seen individuals run into as they've been using these accounts successfully to save for and execute retirement. Some of the mistakes that I've seen are, number one, thinking that, okay, the common wisdom for spend down. We talked about this on the last Wiper retirement plan. Okay. When I talked about don't wait to spend on your Roth accounts, the common thinking, the common spending order is taxable first. So spend on the taxable first, then tap into your tax deferred, and then finally tap into the tax free account. Okay. But what I'd say is sometimes it makes sense to leverage not only distributions from the taxable account, but also distributions from your tax deferred account. To sort of eliminate that tax trap of required minimum distributions that we've talked about before. Once you turn 73 or 75, those RMDs are going to begin. And if that pushes you into a substantially higher tax bracket or triggers IRMA, income related monthly adjustment amount, there could have been an opportunity earlier on during that Roth conversion window where maybe you spend down some of those tax deferred accounts in conjunction with the taxable accounts. Or maybe you took advantage of those Roth conversions and used your taxable brokerage account to pay those taxes early on in that retirement during that Roth conversion window. So just because, even if your plan says, okay, spend on the taxable first and tax deferred second, don't sleep on potentially doing those Roth conversions and using that brokerage account to pay the taxes. Okay, because you don't want to be hit with those unexpected tax liabilities with those RMDs if you didn't necessarily plan for those properly. The second mistake I see a lot of people make is they sort of get a little bit too conservative with these taxable brokerage accounts. They sort of look at this as, hey, maybe this is the first bucket I tap into. Okay. And so maybe it's the first bucket I tap into. So therefore it is a little bit more conservative. Maybe it's got 30 or 40 or 50% in fixed income. But at some point in time, that could transition over into the tax deferred account. So you then begin tapping into your tax deferred bucket. So therefore, there could be an argument to say, you know what, at that point, Now you can make your brokerage account to be very aggressive to optimize that for legacy and reduce the tax drag that that fixed income might have on that particular brokerage account. So again, the tax drag, but also thinking about, hey, the investment makeup doesn't have to be static. It doesn't have to stay the same throughout the duration of your accumulation phase and your distribution phase. You can kind of have different phases with this one. You could say, hey, this is going to be my investment mix when I'm tapping into this for income during retirement. But at some point, once I tap into my tax deferred account or my tax free account, now I can change the investment makeup and make this a little more aggressive to reduce some of those tax efficiencies that a more conservative account might have. The third thing I would say, very similar related and from a tax standpoint, is avoid tax inefficient investments in these brokerage accounts. This is a big mistake I see a lot of folks make, especially that have legacy mutual fund positions that have a high turnover ratio in these brokerage accounts. These can spit out multiple 5 figures or even 6 figures in unrealized capital gains that you didn't trigger because you sold anything, but the fund family triggered the tax because they were buying and selling something within the portfolio, and they pass on those taxes to the shareholder, i.e. you. So if you have some of these legacy positions that are substantial gains in these high turnover mutual funds, you may want to come up with a plan to start trimming those investments over time, because that could create a substantial tax drag as you approach retirement and certainly go into the retirement distribution phase. On the fixed income side on that one, we hit on this one a little bit, but definitely weighing the pros and cons of tax efficient fixed income versus tax inefficient fixed income. And it comes down to your marginal rate, and it comes down to the differences in spreads between the yields on tax-free bonds versus taxable bonds. Again, tax-free being municipal bonds, taxable being corporate bonds or treasuries. Okay, so if you're in a higher tax bracket, I'm going to probably go out on a limb right now and say 32 or 35%. You may want to consider the municipal side. If you're in not a low tax bracket, but you're in the mid-tier, 22 or 24, probably could go either way on that one. If you're in the lower tax bracket, let's say 10 or 12, maybe it does make sense to pursue the taxable bonds, because again, you would need to earn a pretty high yield on the tax-free side for it to make up the difference. And that's oftentimes not the case. But really avoid just kind of falling into this trap of going all in on the tax-free side, because at some point in time, especially if you're early into retirement, maybe your taxable income has dropped substantially. Maybe municipal bonds made sense for you for many years, but maybe now, because of where your tax bracket is, maybe it makes sense to switch over to taxable bonds. And probably a really good time to do this, because you may even have some unrealized loss positions in your fixed income because of what interest rates did in 2022. The fourth thing I'd say is don't forget the tax loss harvest. Okay. Don't forget the tax loss harvest during periods of volatility. I think the common response during periods of volatility is to kind of bury the head in the sand. Don't look at the markets. Don't pay attention to your statement. But if you have a taxable brokerage account, you're going to miss out on opportunities to, again, turn those unrealized losses into realized losses. Okay. So don't bury your head in the sand. Look for opportunities to tax loss harvest, not only on the equity side, but even on the fixed income side as well. And again, avoid that wash sale rule. Avoid replacing that security with, of course, the identical security, but something that's the same security, but something that's substantially identical. Something you want to really be careful with, because you can't even buy that investment back in within your 401k, IRA, or Roth account. Okay, so you want to look at all of your accounts across the board, and you want to make sure you avoid that wash sale rule. So another common mistake I see with these taxable brokerage accounts is related to the account titling and also beneficiary designations. So why don't we start with the beneficiary designations? Oftentimes people have the misconception that if it's a taxable brokerage account, you can't have a beneficiary designation. And that's oftentimes because the terminology is a little bit different. Like if you look inside of your IRA or 401k plan, you'll see primary beneficiary designation and then a contingent beneficiary designation. You can name them those individuals or potentially a trust outright, and then that would skip the probate process. Well, brokerage accounts have the same opportunity, but it has a different term for it. It's called POD or a TOD. POD stands for payable on death, and then TOD stands for transfer on death. And these beneficiary designations act the same way in that those accounts can actually be passed on to those beneficiaries if they are named properly without going through the probate process. So very, very important. If you have these taxable brokerage accounts and it's not inside of the name of the trust, you can potentially still skip the probate process by having those beneficiary designations listed. And this isn't just related to taxable brokerage accounts. This is also related to things like checking, savings, CDs, and just the high yield savings accounts, money market accounts, etc. Speaking of living trust, if you have a living trust, if you spent the money to set up a living trust, it is very, very likely that it makes sense for you to fund that trust adequately with the accounts that you have outside of your qualified plans. So obviously, your living trust cannot own your 401k or IRA, but the living trust can absolutely own things like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, brokerage accounts, and certainly, real estate, et cetera. So if it makes sense for you to fund that trust with your brokerage account, obviously that would then bypass the probate process because the estate plan will follow the trust provisions that you put inside of your living trust. Okay. But very, very important, because I often see, clients all the time, they'll spend the money on setting up these living trusts and they just kind of expect that everything will follow their living trust. But you have to go to those financial institutions, go to your bank accounts, go to your brokerage account institutions and sign the proper paperwork to get your accounts now into the name of the trust. So in other words, to get that trust adequately funded. Just a real quick footnote on this one. If you are a married couple and you own an account jointly with your spouse, very, very common to own those particular accounts with joint tenants with rights of survivorship. But if you live in one of those states that offer joint tenants by the entirety, do some research, check that out, consult with your attorney and see if it makes sense for you to retitle your account with tenants by the entirety as opposed to joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Okay, living in the state of Florida, this was a very common mistake I saw people make when they were moving from other states that didn't have that tenants by the entirety provision for married couples. But it has some really unique creditor protection features that you can take advantage of without worrying about setting up an expensive trust. And obviously, without worrying that those assets are not inside of things like IRAs or 401ks or Roth accounts, et cetera. So tenants by the entirety, if you're a married couple, I think there's 8 states that offer this provision. So again, consult with your own attorney, consult with your own professionals before making any changes on that one. But just a quick little footnote regarding ownership and, of course, like I mentioned, beneficiary designations. Last but not least, mistakes is if legacy is important. Okay, we talked a little about this before. If legacy is important, think about the tax giving strategy, the charitable giving strategy during a lifetime using some of these taxable accounts. This is oftentimes a mistake I see that, people just give cash to whatever charity is important to them. Don't sleep on giving appreciated securities because the benefit there, you're not selling that security and paying the tax and giving it. You're giving that security directly to that qualified 501c3, that charity that you really, really like and care about, or you're giving it directly to a donor advised fund. And if that's the case, then you can take advantage of the tax deduction now, okay? And then you don't have to worry about the taxable gain on those gifts because now it's in the charity's hands. The charity will then sell that asset and they don't pay taxes, okay? So if you are charitably inclined, think about the taxable brokerage account as a potential tool, not necessarily to leave to that charity at your death, but to give during your lifetime. Well, that's it for today's episode, everybody. I hope you guys found value in this episode. And if you're finding value in this episode or even episodes in the past, if you're liking our content, make sure to leave that 5-star review, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you consume podcasts. It really helps us impact more people and help more people, which is really what we're looking to accomplish. And again, make sure to share this with someone else that you believe is a PFR Nation caliber individual. Okay, we're not advertising this podcast. It's really word of mouth. It's really organic. And so if you have someone that you care about, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend that is in a situation where they're over 50, they're looking to accomplish work optional, they're looking to fire their boss in the next handful of years, and they could really benefit from the content we're putting out. Make sure to share our show with them as well. We would really, really appreciate that. And I appreciate all of you listeners out there. I appreciate everyone that's been engaging with us to work with us one-on-one. We're loving that aspect of this podcast is that we can actually engage with our listeners that are looking to accomplish work optional, that are looking to fire their boss, they're looking to maximize spending, they're looking to enjoy this next chapter and ultimately enjoy retirement. We'd love to hear from you all and keep that coming as well. And until next time, this is Kevin Ma signing off.